History as it happens, October 3rd, 2023. Nixon may have been right about Russia.
Even in the final weeks of his life, he gave me his wise counsel, especially with regard to Russia. One thing in particular left a profound impression on me. Though this man was in his 9th decade, he had an incredibly sharp and vigorous and rigorous mind.
Shortly before he died, Richard Nixon gave President Clinton some advice designed to save the U.S. aid program to what Nixon described as America's most important strategic partner, Russia under Boris Yeltsin. The 7-page typewritten memo has now been released to the public, opening a window to that critical decade, the 1990s, that goes a long way toward explaining how Russia got to where it is today. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
After 6.5 years in power, Mikhail Gorbachev confirmed his resignation on television tonight.
The tricolor banner of the Russian Republic now flies over the Kremlin.
I look forward to working closely with President Yeltsin in support of his efforts to bring democratic and market reform to Russia.
Pro-Yeltsin troops started to surround and assault the Parliament building. It has become a symbol of hardline defiance.
His answer on the 4th of that month was to send in the tanks to blast them out of their stronghold.
But I don't believe anyone could ever have doubted that there would be obstacles on Russia's road to a vibrant economy and a strong democracy.
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin, began to establish the Putin era.
The Cold War days are over.
The Cold War is over.
The Cold War is over.
The story now can pretty much be directly traced back to the events of what happened in the 90s. And not in a sense that, oh, well, they were to blame. Everything that went wrong is because of them. But you see the genesis of what happened there.
Discussed a number of other issues. I think I should mention 3 very briefly. First, we agreed that we would both push hard for the ratification of START 2.
October 1995. The Boris and Bill Show comes to Hyde Park, New York.
Close cooperation on nuclear security, and we have a statement that we have already agreed on, prepared by our experts, which will be released.
After attending the UN General Assembly, Presidents Clinton and Yeltsin held a news conference at FDR's old home, where they talked about a bunch of important areas of cooperation: the peacekeeping mission in Bosnia, the START 2 treaty, a test ban treaty, and more. Although this session is best remembered for, well, the Boris and Bill Show and Yeltsin's interpreter.
Наша встреча сегодня она провалится.
And this is all due to you, because coming from my statement yesterday in the United Nations, and if you looked at the press reports, one could see that what you were writing was that today's meeting with President Bill Clinton was going to be a disaster.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю, что вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time, I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Be sure you get the right attribution there.
Я надеюсь, что вы правильно все это поняли.
Это доказывает,
This proves
что наше партнерство слишком крепко.
that our partnership
Что наше партнерство рассчитано не на 1 год,
is
не
too
на
strong.
десятилетие, а на столетие.
Our partnership is not calculated for 1 year or for 5 years, but for years and years to come, tens of years, for a century.
The optimism of the 1990s. But laughing aside, in 1995, despite massive problems in Russia and displays of Russian brutality in Chechnya, the U.S.-Russian relationship looked pretty good, at least from the outside. As Ian Kershaw writes in The Global Age, During the 1990s, it looked as if Russia under President Yeltsin was moving closer to the Western democracies. In 1996, the country became member of the Council of Europe, signing up to the European Convention on Human Rights, and the following year reached an agreement on partnership and cooperation with the European Union. Hopes were expressed in Moscow at this time of Russia in due course becoming a full member of the European Union. Much, however, stood in the way of closer integration. Indeed, to astute observers, those who didn't subscribe to triumphalist notions of the end of history, Russia was already failing its experiment with liberal democracy and market economics. The year before the meeting at Hyde Park, and that would be 1994, Richard Nixon traveled to Russia and Ukraine and then sent a 7-page memo to President Clinton about the precarious situation. Nixon wrote that political and economic freedom in Russia was the United States' major foreign policy priority, but the aid program was a mess, rife with corruption. Yeltsin was faltering, in part because of his excessive drinking. But in Nixon's view, American economists, diplomats, and Congress did not have the right solutions to problems they really didn't understand all that well to begin with. Now, whether Nixon's advice would have solved things is hard to say, but he was right about the stakes. No one could afford to see Russia fail, but fail it did. Now, we all know what Richard Nixon is best remembered for, the epitome of presidential criminality.
From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
But Nixon also had a substantial record, and during the worst days of Watergate, he kept his eyes on the world and the U.S. role in it. July 1974, the month before he would resign, Nixon traveled to the USSR for another summit with Brezhnev.
On a diversionary trip, some say, from Watergate, President Nixon arrives in Moscow and makes touching contact with the Russian people.
And the two leaders signed agreements in a number of areas, including arms control.
He is here for talks with Mr. Brezhnev in a fresh attempt to reach agreement on the limitation of strategic nuclear weapons.
In his retirement, Nixon became a foreign policy sage, and Clinton valued his advice. That clip you heard at the top of the podcast.
Even in the final weeks of his life, he gave me his wise counsel, especially with regard to Russia.
That was Clinton eulogizing Nixon in 1994, and we can now read the memo he referred to thanks to the work of Anthony Constantini, a frequent contributor for the American Conservative who's working on his PhD on populism and the spread of democracy at the University of Vienna. He obtained the memo from the Clinton Presidential Library, and as I said at the top, it opens a window into the critical 1990s, a time of excessive optimism in the West.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
And terrible hardship in the former Soviet Union. A decade that ended with a despot in the Kremlin. A decade we have to understand if we want to comprehend how and why Russia is the way it is today. At war with its neighbor and distant from the open democratic society the Boris and Bill show once made to seem possible. And Nixon did tell Clinton it was time to drop the bromance with Boris, but Clinton did not listen. Hello, Anthony Constantini.
Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the subject, what compelled you to seek out this memo that Richard Nixon wrote in 1994? You did what's called a FOIA in our business, Freedom of Information Act request, to the Clinton Presidential Library, right? They were the ones who were holding it.
Yeah, so this memo had been kind of mentioned and whispered about, or even outright spoken about by Clinton for a while. There was a book called The President's Club, written, I believe, in 2011. And in the first couple pages, he says, I had a relationship with Richard Nixon. Once a year, I read this great memo from him, and it's so brilliant and poignant. And that 13, 12 years ago got me kind of thinking, well, what is this? There have been other memos from Nixon that have come out, things like that. And then a year and a half ago, in early 2022, the Clinton Library had a Nixon and Clinton exhibit where they talked about the relationship, and they had new documents, and it was great. The memo's going to be in there, and it wasn't. It was pretty much the only one that wasn't. And so I forwarded them on a whim. I described what it might have looked like, and they said, hey, we'll get back to you when we get back to you. And then, 9 months later, they said, oh, we found a box. We're going to see if we can release it. And I assumed that there would be some reason why they couldn't, because they always find some reason that they can't release this or that. And then it ended up working. I was kind of surprised, but
wow.
Yeah, so that.
Yeah, usually these things are not released just to save people from embarrassment. I mean, there's nothing in there at this point that needs to be held secret any longer. This is tailor-made for what I'm trying to do here on my podcast. I often say I do an origins podcast, the origins of our current moment. I mean, so much of what Nixon and Clinton were dealing with there in 1994. I mean, we see the implications of that today, don't we? The consequences of those problems. This isn't history. I mean, this is happening now, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the story now can pretty much be directly traced back to the events of what happened in the 90s. And not in a sense that, oh, well, they were to blame. Everything that went wrong is because of them. But you see the genesis of what happened there.
There are no straight lines, and nothing is inevitable, as I'm often reminded doing this show. But it was prescient, what Nixon was talking about. But before we get to his last crusade, which is what you call it in your article for the American Conservative, really we should start in 1992. During the heat of a presidential campaign, Nixon publicly criticizes the incumbent Republican president, President Bush, for his handling of the aid program to Russia. What was happening there?
So Nixon had been, ever since Watergate and he left office, he had refashioned himself into a real elder statesman. He got rid of his Secret Service protection just so he could travel more easily. And he had huge respect abroad because while he obviously had a foreign policy that was dedicated solely to American interests, people abroad kind of felt that he was a straight shooter, that he wasn't trying to do this kind of arrogant thing where he would say, well, America is basically Superman and then act like the Punisher, that he was somebody who was forthright with them, at least. It's the same reason why Kissinger is so respected, even by people who he helped beat 40, 50 years ago. And Nixon had taken multiple trips to the Soviet Union, and then by 92 at that point, the Russian Federation. And he was really, really concerned with how President H.W. Bush had been handling our aid program to Russia. He was concerned about the fact that there was pretty much no attention being paid to how the program was being run. We're chucking money at Russia and then not really looking at how it's being spent, things like that. And in private memos, he said that this is a problem. This is going to be something that will cause issues. And Bush's people continued to ignore him until he felt like he had to take it public.
Bush did not listen to the advice. I mean, Bush wasn't really, and this is really remarkable when you think back to what the national mood was in 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the victory over Iraq, expelling Saddam Hussein's armies from Kuwait, that George H.W. Bush wasn't talking about foreign policy at all by this point in 92, running against Clinton, because it was the economy, stupid. What was Bush's reaction to Nixon's advice that, hey, you got to start paying closer attention to what's going on with this aid program?
He wrote exactly, I will think about it, to Nixon, which was a great way of saying thanks, but no thanks. The way H.W. viewed himself was, look, I was the CIA director. I was vice president. I'm president now. I don't need advice from somebody who he more or less kind of considered a has-been. Nixon, he didn't mince words. He said it was pathetically inadequate, and that if we didn't try to work on Russia's political and economic rights, there would be a new despotism, that they would use force to restore historical borders. And he made a bunch of other predictions, which are just so poignant you would almost think he had a time machine. I mean, pretty much every single thing he said was going to happen was correct. But Bush, running for re-election in 92, the Cold War's over. He literally declared it over in his State of the Union address that year.
But the biggest thing that has happened in the world, in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War.
It would have been basically impossible for him to say, by the way, we actually need to focus back on this. I know we're all done with this. I know we're already thinking more about the Middle East, but we need to focus on this again. And so not only did he not want to do it, but it was also just politically nearly impossible.
But it wasn't like he wasn't paying any attention to Russia. I mean, there was some money going there. I have this actually from the State Department's website. The U.S. State Department has an excellent timeline of events, U.S.-Russia relations in the 1990s. Bush proposed Congress approve an additional $645 million in technical and humanitarian aid to the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States. So that wasn't quite like the USSR. It was kind of a replacement, but not really. But anyway, the point here is he wanted more money to go there. Secretary of State Baker announced, and this is in January of 92, so pretty early and before Nixon's public chastisement, Baker announced an emergency airlift of food and medicine to the former Soviet republics would begin on February 10th. So this is the type of money that Nixon found inadequate, or just the way it was going? No oversight? Was that the problem?
At the time, Nixon was critiquing the amount of money. He said it was way too little. Later on, as we'll probably discuss, in the mid-90s, he didn't really particularly care about how much it was. It was really about how it was being spent. But in 92, he was concerned about the fact that it really wasn't enough. And sure, we had things like food lifts, things like that, but he kind of treated those things as something designed to look very good for a camera. Look, we are literally shipping food into these poor countries. But that's not going to build a foundation for liberal democracy in a place that has much never seen that.
That's right. He compared it to how the U.S. would treat Upper Volta, which was a tiny country in Africa that no longer existed, as he mentioned later on to Clinton in the later memo. Well, here's June of 1992, the Washington summit. President Yeltsin makes a state visit to Washington. The United States pledges $4.5 billion as a share of a $24 billion international program to support economic reform in Russia, as well as additional credit guarantees and technical assistance. Economic cooperation would be enhanced by U.S.-Russia trade agreement, bilateral investment and taxation treaties, and an overseas private investment corporation investment incentive agreement. So what was happening to this money in these agreements in Russia?
Russia was in a very weird place in 1992 where it was the Russian Federation. The USSR was over, but they were still using the Soviet-era Russian Constitution from 1978. So you had a president who Yeltsin had been president of the Russian Soviet Republic, and now he is president of the Russian Federation. But you also still had, instead of a parliament, the most powerful parliament was the Supreme Soviet. And so you had effectively two systems in one country which were struggling with each other for supremacy and would later literally struggle in 1993 in something that was close to a civil war. They were so busy fighting each other, you didn't really have people kind of minding the store. And a lot of these former communist functionaries very quickly figured out that they could get very wealthy through the process of privatization. So we would be shipping money in, and that money would be going to places we weren't paying attention to.
Well, there was immense corruption. By the time Gorbachev exits the stage, Russia has suffered complete economic collapse. And privatization of industry begins in late 91, early 92 in Russia. But this amounts to criminalization of the economy, right? I mean, we always hear about the oligarchs, but that's a true story. What was going on there?
It's hard to describe to people just how horrific early and mid-90s Russia really was. I mean, there would be bodies that would lay on the street for days in Petersburg and in Moscow, major cities, that nobody would pick up. The mob just effectively ran around unhampered. I used to teach English in St. Petersburg, and I would have students who would say, yeah, we would be able to walk out of school and walk into the liquor store across from the police station every day, and nothing would happen because the cops just were not present. So there was no order. The major players who had been, again, these communist functionaries usually were robbing people blind, because what the West was doing was saying, well, we're sending in these advisors to teach them how to privatize the economy. But they weren't sending it to mid-level or low-level Russians. They were sending it to government officials who would then take that advice and then say, great, now we know how to steal all this stuff. And that's exactly what they would do.
I'll share a couple of passages from Ian Kershaw's brilliant book, The Global Age, which is his second volume in his 2-volume overview of 20th century Europe. Actually ends in 2017, so volume 2 goes from 1950 to 2017. This is from page 418. What emerged in Russia, and we're talking early 1990s, was robber baron capitalism. Corruption on a colossal and endemic scale transferred many of the state resources, including the enormous profits from oil and gas, into the hands of unscrupulous oligarchs who invested much of their vast wealth in the West, ostentatiously flaunting their untold riches in luxury Mediterranean yachts or palatial houses in London and other Western European cities. Industrial production in Russia, meanwhile, plummeted. State debt soared, and by the late 1990s, the Russian Federation was bordering upon economic collapse, while much of the population endured a miserable standard of living. And I have another book here by Mary Elise Sarati, her brilliant book about NATO expansion. She also talks about the climate in Russia during this time. Money was going, foreign aid, American taxpayer money, going into Russia and was leaving the country almost immediately because of the corruption.
At one point in the memo later to Clinton, Nixon says, there's been about $25 billion of money that we have sent to Russia, which is now in Swiss bank accounts. I think, to maybe kind of be polite, he says, and they're waiting until it's safer to reinvest it. But between the lines, he's saying, they've just stolen $25 billion that you sent over there, and it's just gone. So yeah, really, it was just pervasive, the amount of theft.
And that's why people had maybe a misplaced, in our view, nostalgia for the stable days of the USSR. Before we move on to Clinton and Yeltsin and the 94 memo, just one more point about 1992. We mentioned the presidential campaign and President Bush not really talking about foreign policy. You know, there are domestic currents pushing back against attention on foreign policy issues. I mean, Congress wasn't really very happy with the foreign aid program. And the American citizenry was losing interest in all this because, well, the Cold War was over. We won, and let's start paying attention to our own issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have, for example, Pat Buchanan in 1992 gives H.W. Bush a decent scare. You know, he was never really going to win the primary, but he gives him a decent scare basically on a, great, Cold War's done. What's the point of any of this?
All the institutions of the Cold War, from vast, permanent U.S. armies on foreign soil to old alliances against communist enemies that no longer exist, to billions in foreign aid, must be re-examined.
H.W. Bush was in a tough place, but it's not like Bill Clinton was wanting to reinvest in Russia. You know, he wanted to focus on the future. He didn't want to say, let's go back and focus on the guys we just beat.
Yeah, there was an absence of foreign policy issues with our recession during 1992, during the campaign. So maybe now is a good time to talk a little bit about Yeltsin's background and his rise to power. We've already touched on the economic collapse of the late communist period. So what else was happening there that made Yeltsin look like, in the eyes of Russian people, a champion as Gorbachev's popularity plummets? Because this has a lot to do with why U.S. leaders put so much faith in Yeltsin later on.
Yeah, so Yeltsin was the final leader of the Russian Soviet Republic. But he wasn't really a communist. He had resigned from the Politburo in the late 80s, partially because he wasn't a communist, partially because he could see what was happening, was that he could see that communism was on the way out. And Gorbachev, who ultimately became his nemesis, he didn't really get that. You know, we in the West love Gorbachev because he was friendly with Reagan and he opened up the USSR. But Gorbachev opened the USSR because he was a diehard communist, and he thought through glasnost and perestroika that people would talk about, look, we love this so much, how can we make the Soviet Union better? Whereas when he opened it up, people said, wow, this is awful, we don't want this anymore. And so then Yeltsin gets elected president in a free election in the Russian Soviet Republic in 91, and then can portray himself as the reformer who wants to lead Russia forward, and Gorbachev as this stale kind of person who wants to keep Russia back.
Well, I think by the end, Gorbachev was seeing himself more as a social democrat than a communist. But he was still trapped within that old structure, right? I mean, I think you're right. His idea was to save communism from itself, to reform it by liberalizing the system. But I think by the end he realized that it had to go as well. And, when you're in charge and the economy collapses, who's going to get the blame? And Gorbachev, you could make the argument, deserved some of that blame because his economic reforms did not work.
No, that's the thing. It wasn't working. It's also partially luck. When the hardliners who effectively wanted something akin to a Stalinist dictatorship had the coup in late 91,
right.
Gorbachev is in Yalta, and it's Yeltsin who rushes to the scene. He stands on their tank. He gives this speech. He looks like a hero. You see those pictures today, and he looks like a hero. Friend of reform, this defender of he's literally standing on the tanks of those who tried to take out democracy in Russia.
That's right. That was in 91. That fatally weakened Gorbachev, who was already severely weakened by that point. Even though as you mentioned, his international reputation was still pretty good. But in Russia today, Russians do not look fondly back on the Gorbachev years. I'll just give an idea of Yeltsin's popularity here. The first free elections in the history of the Soviet Union were in March of 1989, and these weren't truly democratic because there was only one party on the ballot. You had to be a communist to be in these March 89 elections, but you had multiple candidates running for individual seats. I mean, they were all communists, but you at least had a choice this time. In Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, who was opposed by the entire party apparatus, as you said, he was leaving communism behind, won 90% of the votes in Moscow. Boris Yeltsin. That's in 1989, and he only becomes more popular later on. But I'm not sure Yeltsin was ever a committed Democrat. I think you see autocratic tendencies right from the start of his presidency. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think he probably believed that it was better than the system that they were coming from. But yeah, I mean, he is, after all, the man who picks Vladimir Putin to be his successor. And it's not like, in the interview he said, hey, are you going to be committed to Russian democracy here? And especially what we see later in 1996, which is, I view, the year that Russian democracy died, he immediately gives up on democracy just so he can stay in power. He was able to portray himself as this forward thinker because he was portraying himself as somebody who wanted to move past the Soviet Union. But I think a lot of foreign analysts and foreign politicians wrongly viewed him as somebody who was trying to lead Russia into democracy, when he was really just wanted to lead it out of the USSR.
So Clinton takes power in 1993. Here is Mary Elise Sarati from her book, Not One Inch, page 151. According to the U.S. Treasury, in early 1993, inflation in Russia was running at 40% a month. Having pursued radical reforms on the advice of American experts, this is the so-called shock therapy, Moscow is now having deep regrets. The Russian belief that intellectual salvation flowed from the United States was, as German Chancellor Helmut Kohl dryly commented, starting to fade. Leaders in Moscow who had thought they could get all the advice they needed from Harvard now felt that they had been deceived. And this is, we're not talking about 1999 here. We're talking about early 1993. I know that we're going to talk about the 94 memo, but Anthony, this is how my meandering interview style goes. I like to establish the context. When Clinton takes office in early 93, he's already getting a lot of advice. And this is the year before he gets more advice from Nixon. He's already getting advice from Helmut Kohl and from the British establishment on what to do in Russia. What was that advice?
You somehow have to create liberal democracy in Russia, which was essentially saying, look, we really need to grow this alfalfa in the desert. It wasn't something that had ever existed in Russia. It wasn't something that we're used to. And then you had to build this while there was also economic chaos. And so he was getting a lot of conflicting advice about how you do this. But the end that everybody was urging was somehow you need to shore up Russian democracy.
Yeah, the British ambassador to Moscow, Roderick Brathwaite, Sir Roderick, told the Americans, again, early 93, the question he thought should dominate all others was, what can we do to ensure Russia democratizes fully? And British Prime Minister John Major even directly told Clinton, you must give maximum support to Russian President Yeltsin, the only elected leader in 1,000 years of Russian history. And this is citing Mary Elise Sarati. How does Clinton respond to all this? I mean, he's got a lot on his plate, as any new president would. Didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience either.
I think he was aware that he didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. He really focused on Yeltsin. He took that advice to heart. Whether one believes it was because he thought that Yeltsin was a true Democrat whether he just felt that was the way to go. He really put a premium on his relationship to Yeltsin. But in terms of foreign policy in general, Clinton traveled a lot. The only president to travel to more countries was, I believe, W. Bush. But a lot of his foreign policy, at least to me, was very inertia-based. He almost viewed foreign policy to a degree as a distraction. And partially that was out of this 1990s, great, we're the hyperpower and now we don't really need to worry so much about this stuff. Bosnia, he had to be begged by Tony Blair for something like a month to act. Rwanda, pretty much is nothing. You can tell he clearly feels, look, I put my good friend, smart guy, Talbot in charge of the aid program.
Strobe Talbot.
Yes. I have this personal relationship with Yeltsin. This will work.
So it apparently was not working when Nixon makes his trip in 94, but something else happens here that's really important to this story. September, October 1993, Yeltsin spills blood to stay in power by turning the tanks on the Russian White House, which was the parliament. Now, there is debate over who is really to blame here for instigating this crisis. What's your assessment of this event, September, October 1993?
I'm no defender of Boris Yeltsin, especially with what happens later. But I do feel that eventually something was going to have to give, because Russia still really was living with two systems, with this kind of Russian federative system, but then you still had a Supreme Soviet. And they both wanted to go in very different directions in this dichotomy.
There were a lot of communists still in the Supreme Soviet?
To a degree, but it was also a system that had a decent amount of power, whereas Yeltsin had also, de facto, not necessarily de jure, also garnered a lot of power.
Yeah, this was a power struggle, essentially, right? Who should have the most power?
Yeah, when Yeltsin would go on vacation in the summer, the Supreme Soviet would pass a bunch of decrees to cancel his. And it was a back and forth that couldn't really last. It just wasn't going to survive, really.
Yeltsin wanted more power for himself. He accused the Supreme Soviet of usurping executive and judicial functions. But even his own vice president, Rutskoy, called Yeltsin's decree unconstitutional. Russia's constitutional court called for his impeachment. Clinton takes Yeltsin's side in this, even though, 140 people died? I guess what I'm getting at here is some people point to this as the death of the experiment of democracy in Russia. Do you agree with that?
To be honest, I wouldn't. I'd say it comes 3 years later in 96. I think this is probably why Nixon doesn't mention this in the memo, is because the only way to change that constitution from 1978 would have been with the support of the Supreme Soviet, which obviously was never going to give it. And now this isn't to say, well, that's okay to then do unconstitutional things. But if they were to truly break away from what had been the Soviet constitution, the only way to do that was effectively going to be through some sort of unconstitutional means. And I think it's important that at the same time, the same day the new constitution is put into force, they also have elections, which Yeltsin's parties lose. The new Russian parliament is pretty solidly controlled by the opposition. And Yeltsin accepts this. He doesn't say, well, we're going to have new elections again, or this is a farce. He accepts the fact that he now no longer has parties that control parliament. At that point, it still had a chance.
Interesting. So that's late 93, those elections. Just the spilling of blood. I mean, the violence that took place on the streets there in September, October of 93 was pretty ugly. And as you mentioned, Nixon does not mention that in the memo. So here we are, finally, 1994. Why does Richard Nixon, who's 80 years old, he doesn't know that he's going to be gone in about a month, right? He dies that year. He's obviously very, very concerned with what's going on in Russia, the runaway corruption, massive economic problems, internal political strife. Talk a little bit about the context for his trip, because he just doesn't go to Russia. He goes to Ukraine as well. And why was Clinton interested in Nixon's findings, his ideas?
Sure. So he traveled to Russia, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and Germany, mainly because those were sort of the big question mark countries in Europe. The UK was still kind of sort of concerned about a united Germany. Germany was obviously newly united. And then the Russian Federation and Ukraine were literally, in a sense, new countries. You could tell that also Nixon, he didn't think his time was up, but his wife had passed in the previous year. And I don't think he would have been shocked to hear that he wasn't going to make it for the rest of the year. And he had a close relationship with Clinton. Clinton was pretty much the only president he had a close relationship to. Clinton would call him for advice all the time. He would come to the White House and they would talk about things. When Nixon went, Clinton was made aware of this. And as an outsider, because obviously Nixon was not in Clinton's close orbit, And as somebody who wasn't intimately involved in what was going on, not only could be an outside view, he also was a smart political operator. Clinton and his aides knew that Nixon's critique of Bush had injured him politically in 92. Clinton was already having some trouble in 94. Later that year, the Republicans would take the House for the first time in over 50 years. And the last thing he needed was Nixon coming back and saying, wow, this is total junk publicly. So he kept him inside of the tent in a very, very shrewd and smart move.
Well, Nixon did have a keen mind, and he understood the world, and that doesn't mean I agree with all of his takes and his positions. As you said, he did manage to resuscitate his reputation and become a mentor of sorts, or a sage on foreign policy. So what does he find in Russia that he tells Clinton needs to change?
It's 7 pages, and the first page starts, well, here's the good news. People seem to like you. You're pretty well liked pretty much wherever I go, because it's directly written to Bill Clinton. It's just for his eyes only, and then whoever else Clinton allows to see it. And he says, people like you, they like your administration. And that's it. That's pretty much the good news for all of the memo. The rest of it is just bad news. He says, aid is being ripped off by the billions, as we said, 25 billion to Switzerland. It's not being managed well. The people that you put in charge are not managing it well. He says that the diplomats that you have in Moscow and in Kiev are not doing a good job. He says that the guy that you've really picked and put your weight on, Yeltsin, is kind of a bloviating drunkard. It is not healthy. And
yeah, because Nixon earlier had high hopes for Yeltsin as well, but it seems that this trip was the final nail in the coffin for those hopes.
Yeah, big time, because he had met with Thomas Pickering, who was Clinton's ambassador to Moscow. And Pickering passed on. He said, hey, Yeltsin's pretty healthy. He seems like he's doing okay. And Nixon, he uses some very colorful language to describe that piece of advice.
Well, what did he call it? Much, bullshit or something? Right?
Yeah, he said, what did he say? It is not simple doo-doo, it is bullshit. Yeah.
Meaning Yeltsin is in a bad way. That is
terrible.
His conduct and his drunkenness is a real problem.
Yeah, he says pretty much everyone else that he had talked to said, look, he stammers, he drinks way too much. Sometimes he can't even perform his duties. And Nixon said he's probably not going to be a powerful force in terms of somebody who can really make things happen for much longer. So it's just really dismal findings.
So the aid program wasn't working. I think the 2 main points were aid program needs to be fixed, not necessarily more money, but it needs to be fixed, and that Yeltsin is an unsteady horse. Thing is, Clinton knew that about Yeltsin already. And it's very interesting when you read Mary Elise Sarati's book on their personal interactions and what her research was able to find. Clinton told his advisors, listen, I understand that this is not normal behavior for a head of state, but something like, well, he's not a violent drunk. But there's something else at work here, too. Clinton did not feel like he had a viable alternative in Russia. Nixon is giving him some advice on that front over who might be a better person for Yeltsin. But Clinton didn't see it that way. What are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, Nixon names a bunch of names. One of the main ones was Chernomyrdin, who was the prime minister. But even the problem with him, for example, is a lot of the people who could have feasibly been in power had been really closely affiliated with the shock therapy, which was deathly unpopular. My personal take is that I don't believe Clinton really did work hard enough to reach out to opposition candidates. There were some who were nuts. You have like Zhirinovsky, portrayed himself as a radical far-right anti-Semite. It would not have been worth talking to him.
Yeah. And there were some communists too there that maybe weren't the people that you want to be reaching out to either, right?
Well, truth be told, I think that, because that was Zyuganov, yes, who was ultimately, the 1996 opposition candidate. But my take is, and at least what I found looking at whether democracies can survive or fail, is that the most important election in a democracy is the first election in which executive power can switch from one to the other. And if you manage that, you can usually make it survive. And in 1996, Russians had the chance to throw the bombs out, as the saying goes, in this case being Yeltsin. In my opinion, I think it's hard to argue otherwise. So that chance was stolen from them. And I think that was really the death blow. Regardless of who the alternatives could have been, I think that was a death blow to Russian democracy.
So you sound convinced that the 96 election was rigged.
When you look at Yeltsin's approval rating in 1995, it's as low as 3% at one point. And by late 1995, it's around 10, which would make him literally on record as one of the least popular modern elected officials in modern history. And the idea that he goes from as low as 6% to winning by 14 points. It's almost absurd. There's even a comment later from Dmitry Medvedev, who was president in 2008 to 2012. And he even tells the opposition candidates, we know who won that election, and it wasn't Yeltsin. As if it's a joke.
Yeah. Well, the Clinton team tried, they sent people over there to help with the campaign. Well, what's your assessment of the impact there? I mean, how much did the Clinton people really help Yeltsin?
So the White House claimed, we had nothing to do with this. This was a private group that went over and they were hired, but they were always plugged in. They got regular updates as to what was going on. They helped Yeltsin effectively because in 91, when he had run, he was pretty much always going to win. It wasn't a serious, it wasn't, a George Washington shutout, but it was still the sense that he was going to win. He didn't have to run a real party campaign. And the communists had really built themselves up over the last couple of years with an actual party, party gatherings, functions, really trying to be an electoral success. And so the Americans taught Yeltsin's people how to actually campaign in a modern sense. But they did other things too. I mean, Clinton, a couple months before the election, I think it might have been 3, secures a huge IMF loan for Russia, which is, of course, obviously helpful to Yeltsin. There's thousands of, and they're open about this even now, there's thousands of American-trained Russians who are working in Yeltsin's campaign and in the Russian electoral institutions throughout Russia. And more than anything else, he makes clear Yeltsin's the guy. Yeltsin's the guy I want. And then when there's some real, again, going from 10% approval to winning by 14 points, when there's real chance that there was fraud, there's no, wait a second, we need to get these ballots checked. We need to make sure that the Russians' voices are heard. There's great, Yeltsin won, let's invite him to the White House.
You mentioned the IMF loan there. I think we're talking about the same one. Yeltsin is on the phone with Clinton saying, I need this loan. Mm-hmm. Clinton called the IMF, or he had somebody call the IMF on his behalf, but he made that loan happen. Without Clinton, they wouldn't have gotten the loan, and Yeltsin was begging for it for his own survival. So as we established, Clinton does make up his mind here that he's going to stay with Yeltsin despite all the problems. We're talking about the 96 election, which you believe was key there. What's happening with the aid program? We'll go back to that. Nixon is dead about a month after he writes the memo. He wanted the aid program to be fixed. He saw this as being critical to the survival of market reform and democracy in Russia. So what happened with the aid program? Was it fixed? Why wasn't it fixed?
So the only clear-cut, obvious piece of advice that Clinton did take was he didn't fire Talbot, but he kind of fired by promotion. He made him Deputy Secretary of State, which was obviously a move up, but he would no longer oversaw the program. But in terms of the program, unfortunately, Clinton effectively, by the end of the 1990s, the Wall Street Journal was reporting that the Clinton administration's policy was basically pump money until it hurts. I think literally was the headline was send money until it hurts. They still didn't really fix the oversight. Now, partially that's just because Russia was so massively corrupt that you would have had to almost had people in every single room watching to see how money was spent. But they also really didn't try that much harder to increase oversight.
So there's a lot of other things going on as well between the U.S. and Russia. There were nuclear weapons treaties that they were discussing, START 1, START 2, ABM. There was NATO expansion, which was a huge issue as well, the Partnership for Peace, which Russia joined but then became very unhappy with. So there's a lot going on here between these two countries. I mean, all the other things that a new president is taking on as well. But just between the U.S. and Russia, the aid program doesn't seem to have gotten the type of attention that you're arguing it needed to get.
Yeah, I really believe it, especially once the memories of the chaos of those 2 coup attempts in 91 and the effectively successful self-coup that Yeltsin did in 93, once that kind of wore off, it kind of just became, this is how Russia is. By 1997, when Clinton has Yeltsin to the White House in a press conference, I don't know if they both were. At least Yeltsin was clearly drunk, kind of laughing and joking. And it was just like, look at this funny guy. Those Russians. And it was much less of a, wait, we really still need to do this. This is urgent. We need to fix this now.
So would that have been enough, though, to really save Russia?
Just the aid program?
Yeah.
I think the problem is, and this really speaks to a larger issue with our foreign policy, at least in the 21st century, as opposed to how Nixon would do things, was that there were certain things that Russia wouldn't ever be okay with, which is fine. We don't have to do whatever they want, but there were certain things that they would just never be okay with. But because they were too weak to act, we took it as, they're okay with this. And they weren't. And it kind of developed as sores until they were one day actually capable of doing something about it.
You're referring to NATO expansion there?
That's one of the prime examples.
Yes. Was Nixon a supporter of NATO enlargement?
Most of the realists weren't. George Kennan, as one of his last, I don't know if it was his last press conference, but George Kennan, who was the man who set up containment in the late 40s and effectively set up the strategy that helped us win the Cold War, he said, this is going to blow up in our face. This is going to be a catastrophe and a disaster in the years to come. Not especially, no.
I'll offer some more observations from Kershaw here, have you respond to these as well, because history is shaped by individual decision-making, personalities, contingency. There's also structural forces that are really important here, because by the mid-1990s, the former Soviet bloc states, so not the successor states, not Georgia, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. I'm talking about the former Soviet bloc states like Poland, Hungary, etc. The worst of the shock treatment was behind them by the mid-1990s. Economic growth didn't follow the same pattern in every place. Some countries were more successful than others, but Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, things started to look better by the mid-1990s. And as we know, they started to really prosper as the new century unfolded. And some of those countries are doing rather well right now. The difference in Russia, Ukraine, etc., was that the prerequisites for successful, if arduous, transition to market economy, democracy, that generally existed in Central Europe are wholly lacking in an economic zone dominated by Russia. The basis for state regulation of a commercialized economy was as good as non-existent. There was little attraction for foreign investment. The infrastructure was poor, and there were no traditions of the rule of law, pluralist democracy, and a civic culture independent of the state. As mentioned before, what emerged in Russia was robber baron capitalism.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, going back to that metaphor of growing alfalfa in the desert, it's really hard to do that. It's not like before the Soviet Union existed that Russia had been this constitutional democracy or had a constitutional monarchy. I mean, they formally did, but it was effectively an autocracy until the end. You had a history in the rest of the Soviet bloc countries of we were once free. We would love to be free. You had a huge network in the West of a lot of exiles from Poland or from Czechoslovakia who were working to make it free. And so when they finally had the chance, this was the thing that they worked for years. You had Estonians who were still alive who remembered being free. Whereas as the Russians, this was kind of completely new ground. It was kind of, well, now what?
You're right. Czechoslovakia had been a democratic country, an impressive democracy before the destruction by Hitler in the late 1930s. And even Germany had been a democracy for a short time prior to the rise of Nazism. Within Russia itself, its human rights record was terrible. There were some things that were simply incompatible to Russia ever becoming part of the European concert, whether it was the EU or even NATO itself. The first Chechen war was under Yeltsin. I mentioned before Yeltsin's autocratic tendencies. And then after Putin takes power in 2000, he moves the country further away from democracy, being an open society. Because there's a debate going on right now. How much do we blame NATO enlargement, for instance, or EU enlargement for Russian hostility toward Ukraine versus simply decisions that Russian leaders have been making for the last 30 years?
It was hard to say, hey, we're really going to be great friends with you, Russia, when they're pounding Chechnya into dust. You have some great work by, unfortunately, she's been killed, Anna Politkovskaya, who was a journalist in the Chechen War, who recorded the first and second wars. And some of the stuff it's bone-chilling even to this day. But at the same time, I don't take the view, there is this kind of view that of certain Kremlin apologists who basically want to say, well, obviously, the West is responsible for everything that went wrong. We didn't make Russia walk away from the path and walk through all the thorns, but we kind of pushed them off.
I think both things can be true, right? Both things can be true. Yeah, NATO enlargement may have been a mistake, but Russia's own internal problems and internal choices, especially after the end of the disastrous 1990s, right, where a figure like Putin looked to be necessary inside Russia after what the people had just gone through. Putin was very popular in the aughts, early 2000s.
Let's say you're born in the early 1970s in Russia. You're young enough to remember when the USSR was still kind of okay, but most of your growing up, things weren't great. So when it ends, you're prepared to give the new regime a chance. But then immediately it seems like they're selling the country to themselves or to the West. You're hearing about potential NATO expansion, even though they keep saying the Cold War's over. There's mass violence. There's no police. Again, there's bodies on the streets of your city. So in 96, you say, I've had it. I'm going to vote for anybody other than Boris Yeltsin. But then Yeltsin manages to win, even though the Americans keep talking about the importance of democracy and political and economic freedom. And so by 96, you have neither. So while Yeltsin keeps getting drunker and more embarrassing, Putin comes into power, and Putin basically says, with his unofficial deal, look, you're not going to have democracy. It's not going to happen. We're going to keep stealing, but I will keep the violence away from you and your families, day-to-day kind of mob rule. And we're going to give you a basic social safety net. It's not going to be good, but you're going to have at least stability. You won't have political freedoms, but you'll have some economic stability. And the average Russian says, okay, fine. And when Putin actually does that, he gets more popular in the early 2000s.
Yeah, they got a lot of revenue, too, from natural resources, oil, gas. Here's Kershaw one more time. I'll cite him. He talks about Putin replacing Yeltsin in 1999. We've already had one and then a second Chechen war. From then onwards, there was a consistent emphasis on Russian national values and the invocation of the country's status as a great power. Putin started to put an end to the widespread feeling of humiliation at the drastic diminution in the standing of the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to give people back their proud Russian identity and to make them believe in the country's future and a return to former glory. Yet, despite all this, there seem to have been some opportunities for a modus vivendi between Putin and the U.S. It's hard to identify a single time where, we passed the point of no return here. I mean, we had the 2003 Iraq War, which the Russians were opposed to, and they're saying, okay, there's not going to be any unipolar world. You're not going to wave your fingers at us about maintaining the world order. That's basically Putin's message at the Munich Security Conference 4 years later, while the Iraq War is still raging in 2007. Next year in 2008, Bush goes to the Bucharest conference, the NATO conference, and floats the idea of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. Those are red lines for Russia.
Here in Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
What are your thoughts on this whole idea that maybe we could have had a reset, as Hillary Clinton said?
We want to reset our relationship.
Putin did definitely set off on building up that Russian consciousness. Russia had a different national anthem in the 1990s. It was this orchestral kind of somewhat boring piece, and Putin becomes president, and within a couple of years, he brings back the melody of the Soviet anthem. It was very symbolic of, look, we're going to come back from this dreadful 90s. That's done. I agree. There wasn't one point where Putin woke up and said, well, now this is done. But I think it's important to understand where he comes from. He was born in the late 50s or early 60s. While obviously he was born after the siege of Leningrad, he lost a sibling in that siege before he was born. And when he was stationed in Germany, when the wall fell, he radioed Moscow and he said, what do I do? And no one responded. And so he had to go out and bluff his way through people who were trying to get into the building. And he said, well, I'm going to use these tanks, even though he had none. You can kind of almost feel that humiliation he must have felt. He comes in and he's one of the very few, at least in my view, actual nationalists, the people who really want to turn Russia into an empire. A lot of these people, Sergei Lavrov, Shoigu, the defense minister, Lavrov being the foreign minister, have been there since the beginning. Shoigu is the only cabinet official who has been there since the formation of the Russian Federation. They're survivalists. They just want to they like being able to visit Paris. They like being able to visit their friends in very expensive houses. They don't really want to build Russia into this gigantic great empire, but the nationalists do. The problem for, I think, Putin at least is in the early 2000s, he can't do that. The Russians don't really want it at the time, and he's busy kind of dealing with internal stress. And then this is where, unfortunately, I think the West was unwittingly helpful in that, again, we treat ourselves a lot of the time, at least in my view, like Superman. You have this truth, justice, American way, but a lot of the rest of the world views us kind of like the Punisher, not necessarily the bad guy, but just somebody who's a lot grayer than they realize that they are. And so,
meaning it's not a black and white worldview. I mean, gray area. Is that what you mean? Okay.
Sorry, having a mature conversation and using Marvel references. And so, like, when we said
that was a Marvel reference, the Punisher.
Oh yes, sorry, it was a DC Marvel.
I hate those movies. I don't watch them. Go ahead.
No, at this point, I don't blame you. So when Hungary or Russia says something we don't like, our instinct now is, well, that's illegitimate. We don't care, which is fine because a lot of the time those countries say things which are not good, and we don't need to embrace it just because somebody else does. For example, Russia saying, well, you can't let Ukraine choose for itself. That's wrong. But us saying that's wrong doesn't make a country go, whoa, you're right, we're bad and wrong. And so, yeah, in 2008, when George W. Bush insists on putting Georgia and Ukraine into a one day they will be in NATO kind of statement.
Yeah, vague. Yeah.
Russia goes apoplectic, and Putin gives a speech saying, look, this isn't okay. And our response is basically too bad. And so then they instigate the Georgia war.
I think that's one case where you can draw a straight line between the issue of NATO to military conflict, Georgia of 2008.
I think the thing that really then breaks it for Putin is the period of 2011 to 2014, because in that period, Medvedev allows the no-fly zone in Libya, which was just supposed to be a no-fly zone, and it ends with Gaddafi being massacred brutally. I mean, in a really, without getting into details, really brutal manner. And from all the reporting that came out of the Kremlin, Putin apparently rewatched that video like several times, and he was just kind of horrified by it.
And the American intervention into Libya was a disaster.
It was a train wreck in many respects. And then the protests in Moscow happened in Putin in 2012, and Putin, who is already pretty paranoid, sees U.S. intelligence agents everywhere, when in reality those protests were almost certainly just actual angry Russians. And then finally you have Maidan, which was uprising against the president of Ukraine, who had said he would be pro-EU and then switched to being pro-Russia. And while it was clearly an uprising by the Ukrainian people, Russia always said, oh, well, this is a CIA coup. Obviously, this is just a false color revolution. And while it was clearly a real revolution, John McCain showed up in Maidan. The head of the CIA openly went to Kiev. And while that was not proof that, this is all just an American. Yeah, it didn't help. It didn't help the appearance of what was going on.
That's right. In 2014, Yanukovych was about to sign a trade deal with the EU that had been worked on for years to try to get Ukraine more integrated with the West. But then Yanukovych, under pressure from the Kremlin, cancels that trade deal. I didn't even mention the 2004 Orange Revolution. Kuchma, who is the president of Ukraine at the time, Kuchma was a brutal, corrupt, pro-Russian leader in Kyiv. There was another, fixed election there to keep him into power. That led to the Orange Revolution. To your earlier point, Putin did not like that, but he wasn't in a situation yet to do something about it.
Henry Kissinger had a piece after the invasion of Crimea where he said, obviously this is bad, and the West should not accept this because it's a direct attack on our world order. And he said, however, we don't have to agree with this, but we have to understand that the idea of NATO, which in Russia's mind reads German and American, tanks being 200 kilometers from Volgograd sends nightmares into the heads of any Russian strategic planners. And the problem is the Kremlin always makes such kind of insane arguments that if you point that out, it sounds like you're then also agreeing with the insane things that they also say. And this kind of goes back to, we don't need to agree with what they're saying. And this was really, I think, Nixon's point throughout his career. We don't have to agree with our enemies, but we have to understand where they're coming from.
Strategic empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
Even in the final weeks of his life, he gave me his wise counsel, especially with regard to Russia. One thing in particular left a profound impression on me. Though this man was in his 9th decade, he had an incredibly sharp and vigorous and rigorous mind. As a public man, he always seemed to believe the greatest sin was remaining passive in the face of challenges, and he never stopped living by that creed. He gave of himself with intelligence and energy and devotion to duty, and his entire country owes him a debt of gratitude for that service. Oh yes, he knew great controversy amid defeat as well as victory. He made mistakes, and they, like his accomplishments, are part of his life and record. But the enduring lesson of Richard Nixon is that he never gave up being part of the action and passion of his times. He said many times that unless a person has a goal, a new mountain to climb, his spirit will die. Well, based on our last phone conversation and the letter he wrote me just a month ago, I can say that his spirit was very much alive to the very end.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, spies, and more spies. Historian Calder Walton has written an essential book. Its title is Spies. It's about the intelligence war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and now Russia. We're going to get into that with the author next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.